So the topic for tonight's talk is archiving the city from objects to relations. This is something that is very close to my heart. I'm trained as an architect, but the fact that I'm teaching in an art school makes it a very interesting hybrid practice and teaching. And I adopt a lot of art practices in the teaching of architecture and design. So archiving the city is a way for me to bring the art design nexus into my practice as well as my teaching. So what is an archive? We all know that it's a place where you can look for information. I'm sure many of you would have been to an archive for your research because they have information, documents, memos, artifacts, audio-visual materials. This is something that is really standard, pretty common in all archives. Libraries, national archives, museums, non-profit organizations, these are places where this information, data, audio-visual materials are housed. But then again, we, in a way, are also archivists because I'm sure you have old families, old photos of families, documents, family heirlooms, things like that, that you have kept over the years. So in a way, we are all archivists. At the same time, the institution, right, they will also have copies of our birth certificates, for example, or citizenship papers. So it's not something that is just limited to our home, but it's also an institutional, a place where an institution will house certain of these documents. A good example is the National Archives and Records Administration in the US that has over 1 billion information in various media. Now, what is interesting is who decides what to keep. If it's your own family, obviously that's very clear. But what about a city? What about an institution? Who decides what to keep? Because French philosopher Jacques Derrida says there is no political power without the control of the archive, if not memory. So the archive is not just a place where you keep something, but it has a larger political implication as well, and control. Because the archives affirms the past, present, and future. But what we use to archive also impact what can be archived, especially in this day and age where social media is so popular and things appear and disappear, right? How do we begin to keep this very ephemeral information? What do we use to keep them? So there are 4 things that I think is really important, you know, for myself and also for anyone who is interested in archiving. The first will be, why must it be archived? Who is it for? What are the methods and the media used for archiving? And how is the archive sustained? As you know, it has to last beyond just the moment where you kept or collected the information. So running through some art projects, this is by Christian Boltanski, right? A very famous artist that approaches art through archival method, dealing with the issues of memory loss, past experience. Song Dong, a project called Waste Not, where together with his mother, they laid out in a very systematic manner all the things that the mother has kept for the past 50 years. And for Song Dong, it's a way to help his mother to find a place, or rather a space, to put her memories and history in order. And this happened, the first installation happened when Song Dong's father passed away. And this was a way for him to help her mother overcome her sadness. Then you have Xu Bing's tobacco project. Some of you may be familiar. Very fascinating because he uses tobacco as the subject and the medium and use that as a way to explore issues from global trade to people to the health issues of tobacco, cigarette smoking. And what is fascinating for me is that he started the project when he met this lady, Caroline Su, and he found out that she collects a lot of cigarette holders. And that was a starting point. And then through a process of interviewing, getting to know her family connection to tobacco, and then relating it to Richmond, Virginia, which is the home of Philip Morris, as you know, one of the biggest manufacturer of cigarettes. So you can see how that process of uncovering history through a very slow, deliberate archival process helped him in the creation of this art project. Gramsci Monument by a Swiss artist, Thomas Hirschhorn, where he set up a pavilion. He calls it the Gramsci Monument. Gramsci is an Italian political thinker, philosopher. But what is fascinating about this monument is that he employed the residents, some of the residents from the Bronx, asked them to help him construct this monument. And it's not just a space where you display some of Antonio Gramsci's artifacts, such as the comb, the slipper, and the wallet, but it also has a snack bar. There's a stage for performances, and they even produce a daily newspaper, as well as a radio station. I think that is really fascinating, how the notion of an archive can be expanded to encompass many different media and also engages the public in the process of constructing this monument, this archive. Now for me, I'm interested in the archival process because it helps me to see the city with new eyes. I'm sure this is very familiar to you, but for me, having come to Hong Kong several years ago, and to be able to see this fascinating display of objects in public space was quite an eye-opener for me. I'm sure for every one of you here, you're so used to this that you perhaps would think that these are daily things that would happen repeatedly, maybe to the point of being very boring, right? But I asked myself, what happens if we begin to see this as works of art? They are public sculptures, they are performances. It completely changes your whole perception of what you see out there every day. Archiving as a cultural asset is something that I deploy in my practice as well. Again, this is very familiar to all of us. I have a few hundreds images of the KONG or San. And for me, this is a very personal project because when I was young, one of my tasks every day, which I dread, was to go down to the ground floor and to put some joysticks on the Kong. Because my grandma has arthritis, so we live in a shop house and she's unable to go down to the street level. It was really a chore. It wasn't very interesting for me when I was a kid, but when I came to Hong Kong and I saw this, you cannot find this in Singapore anymore, unfortunately. It was like, wow, this is so incredible, you know? So I went around and started taking pictures. This is just the beginning. I wanted to also analyze the different Kong. As an architect, how do you begin to look at this as a typology? And what is interesting for me is that looking at some of the shops, those Kong that are less or not so well taken care of, you know, somehow it tends to be reflected in the shops as well. Some of them are rather poorly maintained. Some are empty. It's just a niche without the altar. And I find this really incredible. So this is a way for me to curate a certain cultural artifacts that has been lost for me as a Singaporean. But somehow that evolved into a paper that I co-wrote with Professor Siu from Hong Kong Poly U. We went around different parts of Hong Kong and Singapore to document all the informal religious shrines. A lot of us would see this as perhaps an eyesore, right, at the street corner. But we're trying to argue that these are really community assets, whether it's in Hong Kong or in Singapore. And this is fascinating. How do you adopt a Guan Yin? So there was an informal shrine, and the caretaker told me a lot of people put the Guan Yin there because either they moved, right, or the elder generation passed on and the younger generation, do not want to continue the practice. So they would put the Guan Yin there as up for adoption. So I asked him, what's the process of getting a Guan Yin, for example? And there is a ritual, right, that you have to go through. And if you're successful, you bring the Guan Yin back. If you're not, you have to wait for the next auspicious day in the year. So archiving or archival practices help me to expand how I see, how I teach, and how I practice architecture. And it all started in 2009. As some of you recall, that was the start of the Great Recession, right? A lot of my students, they couldn't find work after they graduated because of the recession in the US. But unfortunately, when we were teaching architecture at the time in Chicago, it was rather odd because we were getting students to design high-end housing, museums, wonderful projects. But when I went back to my office, the Dow Jones was falling. Some killed themselves, people were out of work. And then when I went back, we were talking about high-end condos and museums, and I felt something was not right. Maybe because of this crisis, we need to rethink how we teach, how we see the city, and how we expand the role of an architect. So I went back to my office and wrote a proposal within about, I would say, about half an hour. It was the fastest proposal in my life, and I just sent it off. A few months later, someone with a strange accent called me and say that, congratulations, you have been awarded the fellowship. I thought it was my colleague. There was a Dutch colleague in my office. I thought he was playing a joke on me. I said, are you kidding me? I said, no, it's real. You won the fellowship. So this really started the whole process of going through different cities, 4 cities in Asia, to look at how do we live without, or how can we live, how can we work without having to build a new building? How can we share space? How can we borrow space? How can we improvise with what we have rather than building something new? So I went around the city, the 4 cities, and documented, curated a series of activities that you can do or are already happening, either in Hong Kong, in Bangkok, in Singapore, or in Beppu, Japan. An amazing array of activities, from aerobic dancing to rollerblading, to food store, gambling, even a brothel without a building in a forest. You can study, you can bird watch. So there's so many things you can do, almost everything, without having to build a new building. And what is fascinating, I was through that process, I began to discover the kind of social, economic network that allow these people to be able to sustain in this place, whether to work, whether to live, or whether for recreation. And I began to map, archive, collect all this network. I interviewed a gentleman who lived in Sam Sui Po, stay with him in his illegal rooftop home, and observe the kind of subtle relationship between him and the tenant. And also when the building inspector came, how did he manage to get away by convincing the inspector that the place will be demolished very soon, but he has been living there for over 15 years. It was a very fascinating relationship, that dynamics, right, between the tenant and him and the building inspector, and how he used that in a very creative way to live in an illegal rooftop home for over 15 years. He passed away in 2014 when I went and visited him during that year after a brief illness. So you can read about, I wrote about my relationship with him and how we discussed about this illegal rooftop home. You can read about that through my website. So I also use the archiving process in the way I teach. This was a studio that I was invited by the co-curators of the Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture. So every 2 years they have this biennial, one in Hong Kong and one in Shenzhen. So two of the co-curators in the Shenzhen part of the biennial invited me to bring my students to Shenzhen for 5 days to run he calls it an architectural workshop. But the students who signed up were artists and designers, maybe 1 or 2 architects. So again, with a very limited time, even though it was 5 days, the first day was orientation, the last day was an exhibition. So there's very little chance for really getting to know the city. So instead of designing a building, trying to redesign Shenzhen in 4 days or 3 days, I decided maybe we should learn from Shenzhen rather than bring our own ideas into Shenzhen. Maybe we can learn from the people. So I call it learning from Shenzhen. This is one of the projects that I work with a student. I use a flashcard method. As you know, when a kid tries to learn a new language, we'll use a flashcard. Okay, this is a dog, right? And I thought maybe we can learn in a very basic and very humble way, almost like a child. So we went around the city. We asked the residents, from 80-year-old to university student, use one character to describe Shenzhen. So you see a whole variety of responses. And something that was really fascinating, and it wasn't planned, it was when we printed out the pictures, we realized the fingers tells us a lot about the things they do, who they are. University students' fingers are very different from workers. She has a very beautiful set of fingernails. An urban designer, right? After many years of education, kept it very simple. So it was fascinating, something that we didn't really realize until we start printing out all these pictures and we laid out and said, look at the fingernails. This was another project. What are you waiting for in Shenzhen? And this came about really interesting because when we walk around, right, and it happened everywhere, whether it's in Hong Kong, in Chicago, or in Singapore, we don't look up anymore. We are always looking at this thing that we're holding in our hands, right? Even when we're walking. And I noticed that the concept of waiting is very different because you don't really need to wait because you have this to entertain you, or you could be texting your friend and say, I'm on the way, 15 more minutes, even though you're 1 hour away, right? So you don't need to wait anymore. So we were thinking maybe we want to ask people, what are you waiting for in Shenzhen? And it was a fascinating thing because we we discover something else, that people do wait. It may not be waiting for your friend, right, who is late. Like this lady, at the station, she was waiting to start her new job. I don't know what she meant, but she was waiting for happiness. This lady was waiting for her daughter to grow up. Fascinating. We never thought of this, right? We were thinking, oh, nobody waits anymore. We are always on our cell phone, playing games, watching Korean drama, right? Chatting with our friends. But in reality, people are waiting for something. You know? There was another lady, she said, I'm waiting for a good story, because she's a writer. I thought that was so beautiful. This is another project. A group of students, they found out that in Shenzhen, you wear the same uniform from elementary school all the way to university. It was very shocking for me. Imagine you have to wear the same uniform. Of course, it gets bigger, right? You have to wear the same uniform all this time. But what happens is that the Shenzhen students are extremely creative. So they will improvise. They will, guys will make the pants a bit shorter at that time, maybe now a bit longer. The girls will do something to, the uniform. So the fact that it's something that is uniform, right? The word uniform means you are homogeneous, you are the same as everybody next to you, but they improvise their own uniform so that they have a sense of identity. And I thought that was really fascinating. There was another group of students who went to Baisuzhou, and it's an incredible urban village. A lot of migrant workers stay there because it's very cheap. And they were quite shocked. And the students are from China, but they were rather shocked by what they saw in the urban village, the way they live. And they asked, well, maybe I can ask these people, what is a good life? What is good life for you? So during the exhibition, we invited people from Baisuzhou and also the participants in the biennial to come and write down their ideas of what is a good life. What is the ideal environment that you would like to live in? Food and shopping. So this is a moment that I want to introduce the concept of social archiving. It's a term that I coined. It's still a concept in process. I'm still working on this, and I'm very happy to have a chance to share with everybody here, because I would also like you to help me perhaps co-develop this idea, or perhaps questions and suggestions that we can have later on with Samson in our discussion. But basically, what I wrote, as a concept is that it's a new form of archiving that combines gift-giving, safekeeping, curating, placemaking, and also the renewal of a life of a collection, both through an in-person ritual and through a digital interface. And in the process, you can use that as a platform for intergenerational learning, public stewardship, building a personal legacy through sharing of stories related to the archive materials. So we did some test run, just a way to test out the idea, whether it works, what are some of the things that we may have missed out. I'm still continuing the project next year. But this quotation is beautiful. I mean, we're always talking about community. We are talking about how can we work within the community, how can we help the community. But a community starts when part of the self is given away. I thought that was a very beautiful way to describe how you begin to work in a community. First, you need to give something, not to get something. So the social archiving project is part of the Curating Wampo project that I I am currently doing with Sound Foundation in Singapore. It's a 2-year project, as you can see, from 2016 to 2018. So there are basically 3 objectives: to showcase the intangible cultural heritage of Whampoa, to build capacity among local residents to become community curators and archivists, and also finally to explore the creation of a living museum in the neighborhood itself. So we have planned a series of activities and events. In fact, Community Museum Project, Prof. Siu will be in Singapore between October and November as part of a team to help facilitate the training of community curators and archivists. So what are the characteristics of this social archiving concept? Again, this is still a work in process, and I will be really happy if you can help me to strengthen it, help me to see this concept perhaps in a clearer light. So first and foremost is interdisciplinary. It's not just about storing or keeping things, but it's also about design, it's also about art making, it's also about sharing. It promotes social interaction, as I mentioned earlier, both in digital and in person. As an architect, I'm very interested in how that will help bring people together to think about spatial strategies to address contemporary urban social cultural concerns. But whether it's successful or it fails, it really depends on the interest, passion, and care and the housing of the artifacts offered by the community, whether you are the archivist, the collectors, or the curator, rather than the control and management of an institution. Social media is really important because it helps maintain contact between the person who is giving away the material and the person who is collecting, and also perhaps in the future that you want to give it to someone else. This is the part where I would like to also see the collection, not just something that you store in the storeroom, but you can also use it in a creative way that you can reinterpret, you can repurpose, you can give new meaning to the collection. And you can give it to someone else. It can be a very intimate relationship between two or a group of persons, or it can be large, big, involve a large community of people. So Tangible Stories is a project within the Whampoa initiative that I mentioned just now that sort of started this social archiving idea. Right? So over a 2-month period, myself and 3 other friends, we went around the neighborhood to collect stories of objects that were collected by the elder residents. And the premise really is that objects are not something that we buy, we use, and we throw away. But they have meanings. Whether they are personal memories or history. And through the process of interviewing the elderly, we realized that it provided them a way to anchor themselves in a very fast changing society. So this lady, she spoke about a present that was given to her by her boss on one of the Chinese New Year, many years ago. And she said every time when she kept this, when she looked at it, it reminded him, or rather her, of him, her generosity, her kindness. And she even shared with us and said she has not told her daughter about this collection because it was so private. So we were really lucky that she was agreeable to share this with us. And we asked her, are you going to talk to your daughter about this collection? And she said, no. Okay. This is a very old iron that this lady, Madam Peng, she used when she was, when she was a housewife many years ago. She's already 91 years old. But what is fascinating about this is that that's her son in his 70s, and that Madam Peng, and they were like teasing each other and joking, and the son would say, "Oh, are you sure this happened? You have dementia, right?" So something that it seems very sensitive, we don't want to mention, it seems very rude to talk about these things, but they talk about it in such an open manner. And we were laughing and then the mother would say, "No, of course it happened, right? You remember when you were a kid?" So they were talking to each other, and arguing and in a very open and frank way. It was so inspiring. So for this quotation by Arthur C. Brooks was amazing because, and I totally agree, right? When we look at a lot of people, 1 million is a statistic. But if you look at just one story, right? Just one person, it becomes a very intimate human story. And this is really how we try to approach this Tangible Stories project. This is a Malay gentleman. He is not very mobile, but he likes to make styrofoam models of airplanes and houses. Another elderly lady, she's in her 70s, she collected a lot of old movie posters, newspapers, her high school artwork, and also traditional games as well. So I mentioned to you some of the characteristics of this social archiving concept. The idea that it's scalable. We had a sharing session where everybody came together, like a room like that, and everybody set up their little table. They start talking about their objects, they start sharing, and it was such an amazing experience. One of the elderly, her grandson came to me and said, "I found out more about my grandmother tonight than I've ever known before," because she was telling him about her wedding day, what she was wearing, and all the rituals that she has to go through, and all that kind of stuff. So Jessie is a 76-year-old. She's single. She lives on her own. And during the time when we went to her home, she has this huge collection of movie star posters, calendars, magazines, Chinese opera, newspapers. And she said, "You know what, I'm moving to a smaller elderly studio flat. It's about a quarter of the size of the flat she is living now." And she says, "I'm single. There's nobody to pass this thing to. I'm going to throw it away." And we were shocked. We said, "Look, these things are priceless. You shouldn't just throw it into the trash can." And this is a diagram to sort of illustrate the situation. Imagine if this were the flat, and if she's going to move into a place that is smaller, there's no place for her to keep these things. So she has to throw away. But what happens if we were to come in together with her? We help to archive, we help her to curate these things. Obviously not everything, something that she thinks is important to her. And we managed to build up a collection of about slightly over 100 objects. The Asian Film Archive from Singapore came down. They also helped us to see what are the important magazines and newspapers that we should keep. We had a photographer came in and documented the whole process as well. And this is the fun part. So Jessie used to work for this company called Tangs Holding. Some of you who like shopping and you were in Singapore, you may have gone to Tangs in Orchard Road. So that was her first and last job. And she collected the shopping bags from Tangs since the day she started work after high school. So I managed to contact the new CEO of Tangs, right, Sean, who was the son of Jessie's former employer, and invited him to Jessie's home, right? And he was shocked because Jessie was showing him pictures of his father, you know, when they were married, and say, I think this could be you know. So Sean went, you know, spent some time, talked to Jessie, and after that, he was so inspired that he says, I'm going to set up a tanks archive. I'm going to start collecting a lot of the older staff who work for tanks, who have fond memories, you know. And Sean left with quite a bit of things that Jessie collected, and they were given by Sean's father to Jessie. So now she's giving it back to Sean, and he's going to set up an archive to showcase not just a personal legacy, but also a corporate legacy. You know, this is not a company that, you know, is about just shopping, but we're also thinking about history, meaning, legacy, things like that. So as Sean is setting up the archive, I'm looking at the possibility of a website. And this is just a prototype, it's not live yet. But even before I go into that, I talk about how we should not be just an object that you keep in Tang's archive. Perhaps it's something that you can reinterpret, you can be creative with it. So I managed to contact a group of high school art students, and I showed them the collection, and I say, you know what, can you design a companion for this object? And they are 16, 17 years old. So they went to interview, to talk to these people. And this is one of the students, and she was so, through talking with one of the elderly, it reminded her of her home in Russia. This is a student from Russia. And she began to paint from memory of her home in Russia, the food that she ate, right, while as a kid. So this was a companion for one of the artifacts. This is a porcelain pillow, which a lot of us, including the students, were shocked. We wonder, how can you sleep on this porcelain pillow, right? Because now we sleep on memory foam, right? But this is not memory foam pillow. So she was so taken and so surprised and shocked by this that she decided to make a companion for this porcelain pillow. This was a series of objects that she made. They are pillows, but they are ceramics pillow. And what is very beautiful about this is that because it's a natural material, some of the areas crack as well. And when we asked her, you know, is that intentional? And she said, yeah, I mean, you know, when we think back about our past, you know, memories are not perfect. There are gaps in between. It's a process of reconstruction. And maybe those gaps, those physical gaps, kind of represent the gaps as we begin to think back about our memories. So it's also a very poetic way to design this companion for the artifact. So another student interviewed and told a collection of old bus tickets. And he designed this machine that has one singular bus ticket, but every time when you bring your hand towards the ticket, it moves back in, so you can never bring or take the ticket. And the idea behind is that when you're collecting something, it's really the thrill, the excitement of finding the collection, the last ticket, or the first ticket, or the ticket that has the same number as your birthday. So this excitement and thrill is something that he wants to bring across, you know, that you can never find that perfect collection. It's futile. This was the dollar coins, the commemorative coins. And this student, through the interview with the elderly, kind of imagine who is this employer, how does he look like. So this is purely fictional, right? And she created a series of companions for the coins itself. This is a very beautiful piece of work. this student, Zhihen, interviewed, you remember this Malay elderly person who made styrofoam models? So I was so caught up with the styrofoam models because as an architect, that's the first thing I see. I don't see human beings, right? I see only objects. But as a very sensitive art student, the first thing he saw was the photograph of the elderly person when he was very young, when he first got married to his wife. And that was the picture on the wall. So he says, you know, I'm not going to do those styrofoam models because I noticed that that was the only thing hanging on the wall. So he took that as a starting point. So he totally ignored our collection. So he made a painting. Superficially, it doesn't seem very creative, right? But you know how he did this? When he was interviewing the elderly, he realized that the place was rather dirty. So he helped him to clean up the place. So every time when he goes, he swept the floor for him, and he collected all the dust. That was made from the dust from the home. When he told us the story, I wanted to bow down and, you know, I think you can be a professor, you know, I'm so useless, you know. It was incredible. 18 years old, right? So that's the students. They had an exhibition, and the elderly folks went, and you know, they were really happy. The member of parliament, the politician, was there also. He was also very happy that there's an intergenerational sharing and creative, you know, making. And we had this exhibition throughout Whampoa. We set up an installation, you know, and this moved around different areas in the neighborhood. People come talk about the collection, the stories that we collected, we edited them, and then we turned them into little artifacts that people can read them. And this was a website that this is still, you know, a prototype. I'm not sure how this is going to evolve, but the website is really a way for me to bring the digital and the social interaction aspect into the project. So imagine this is Jessie, and she has a little introduction about herself. And these are some of the collections that perhaps she wants to share or to give away. And then, you know, that's me, you know, and then when I go to her website, I say, hey, that was the galvanized pail that I took a shower in when I was a kid. Because every one of us shower in a galvanized pail during those times. And I contacted Jessie and said, can I keep it? You know, can I keep it for you? Because it has a, you know, very strong memory for me. And I said, you know, when I was a kid, my mother bathed me in this. And then you have the porcelain pillow. You showcase the work by Shao Qi, who did the pillow project. But again, coming back to me as an architect, I also want to use this as an opportunity to see how we can include cultural heritage in the design of public spaces. I'm also interested in aging in community. How can we design not just for the elderly, but for all ages, in a sense. So this is the ground floor of the studio apartments that Jessie moved into. It's very clean. It's very simple, but it's also, there's no life to them, you know, in terms of how the space is designed. So hopefully, with this collection of things, we can begin to approach the URA in Singapore, for example, approach the Housing Development Board, for example, to use this as a way to push for a much more culturally inclusive design in public housing in Singapore. Again, also as an educator, I'm looking at the possibility that I can bring my students and use Whampoa as a studio, as a classroom, rather than in an aircon room in the university. As you saw just now, there were some really wonderful works that were done by high school students, right? maybe that might be a great opportunity for students to understand deeper about their role as an architect in society. So this is kind of like the ecosystem. In order to make this work, it's not just an idea that I have in my mind. I need to be able to connect with all these things. How do you sustain this in the long run? There's a lot of partners that I need to work with because you're dealing with public space, you're dealing with government agencies, you're dealing with schools, teachers, residents. How can I begin to get them excited about this project? Because if it's just a one-off project, it can be very interesting, but it doesn't have a real impact in the long run. So this is the last slide, and I like this slide a lot because, as you know, everybody wants to be everybody, mayors and governments and cities, they want to be a creative city. But then if art is not part and parcel of your everyday life, then all you have is just a city of artistic events. It's not embedded into your everyday life. And hopefully, through the social archiving project, through the Curating Wambo project, and also through the Togawan project, this weekend, perhaps we can take a tiny steps towards making a city that is not just about artistic events, but art is in everybody's everyday life. Thank you.